Do you remember when we were promised EarthBound 64? EarthBound, a game so weird, so wonderful, and so willfully unmarketable that it somehow became one of the most beloved cult classics in the JRPG genre. Released in 1994 on the Super Famicom as Mother 2, this oddball adventure dared to ditch medieval castles with moody teens with spiky hair in favour of psychic children, UFOs, and new age retro hippies. While the rest of the industry was busy wielding broadswords and summoning dragons, EarthBound handed players a cracked baseball bat, a frying pan, and a phone call from a dad who only existed as a disembodied voice on the end of the line. This was a game like no other. The game was set in a satirical, exaggerated version of suburban America, filtered through a Japanese lens. Despite never making it to Europe at the time and flopping hard in the US, surprisingly, the franchise was favourable enough back home in Japan that the developers were already gearing up for a sequel on the next generation console, the Nintendo Ultra 64, before EarthBound had even reached the West. In fact, this new entry would end up being one of the first games publicly announced for Nintendo's 64-bit system. It was to be a bold, boundary-pushing evolution of EarthBound and would come to be known in infamy as EarthBound 64. I am Lady Decade, hit that subscribe button because this is the unreleased EarthBound sequel that Nintendo left behind. Many dub the era of the Super Nintendo as the golden era for JRPGs, with Square in particular being on a roll throughout this era. They delivered smash hit after smash hit, some of which are now considered among the greatest games the role-playing genre has ever produced. Speaking of this golden era, what's better is that by using my affiliate links, you can now nab Chrono Trigger for just $7.32, the OG Final Fantasy for just $7.21, as well as up to 90% off thousands of games, both retro and modern alike. Grab a shopping list of titles for next to nothing, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. To truly appreciate how EarthBound 64 ever came to be, or rather, never came to be, we need to spin the clock all the way back to 1989. Picture it, Japan, in the midst of its bubble economy, with shoulder pads and a national obsession with Famicom cartridges. It's here that we meet Shigesato Itoi, not a game designer by trade, but a celebrity copywriter, essayist, and TV personality who decided, rather boldly, to give video games a try. Teaming up with Nintendo, Itoi founded a studio called Ape Incorporated and dove headfirst into game development. His debut title? Mother, a quirky role-playing game about a psychic schoolboy named Ninten who travels across a parody version of America to save the world from a mysterious alien threat. Forget elves and fireballs, this game had UFOs, talking lamps, and Cold War paranoia. As for his collaborator, just a little known figure named Shigeru Miyamoto, who kindly lent his producer powers to get the project off the ground. But why call this game Mother? The name Mother itself was inspired by the John Lennon song of the same name, a track that struck a chord with Itoi due to his own estranged relationship with his father. In the game, Ninten's dad is never seen, only heard on the phone, a subtle but powerful design choice that Itoi would later revisit in EarthBound, where the absent father figure became something of a franchise staple. Despite being fully translated and scheduled for a 1991 Western release under the title EarthBound, Itoi's original mother never actually made it to the NES in the end. The official reasons have always been a bit of a murky cocktail of marketing hesitation, financial jitters, and Nintendo's growing obsession with the shiny new Super Nintendo. Why risk pushing a quirky 8-bit RPG in a 16-bit world after all? So, just like vending machines that dispense used underwear or anime that definitely isn't safe to watch with your nan, Mother remained something exclusive to Japan, a relic of a very silly place indeed. And yet, even locked behind the shores of the Pacific, Mother managed to sell an impressive 400,000 copies. It didn't just resonate with players, it became a legend. Famitsu readers later voted it into their list of the top 10 Famicom games of all time, which is no small feat, in a library dominated by Plumber Brothers and Space Bounty Hunters. With that kind of success and a new 16-bit console now in living rooms across Japan, a sequel was practically inevitable. The sequel would arrive in 1994, Mother 2, also known as EarthBound, a surreal satirical RPG where you fight hippies with yo-yos, talk to Mrs. Saturns in a font that looks like it's been written during a sugar crash, and battle cosmic horror with the power of friendship. The game was unlike anything you had ever played. Nintendo of America, desperate to make the weirdness stick with Western audiences, invested a whopping $2 million into a marketing campaign built on reverse psychology. The slogan, "This game stinks," which honestly might be the most honest bit of ad copy they've ever produced, even if it was meant ironically. In an effort to push EarthBound onto unsuspecting Westerners, Nintendo of America stuffed the game into an absurdly large box, the sort you'd expect to find housing a toaster, not a humble RPG. Inside was a full-colour strategy guide designed to gently shepherd newcomers through the bizarre world of Onnit and beyond. Nintendo were convinced that this extra hand-holding would help the game break out of the RPG niche and attract the so-called non-gamers, a mythical demographic that marketing departments are still chasing to this very day. To hammer home its irreverent tone, the guide even came with a scratch and sniff panels. Yeah, really. A few brave and unlucky players scratched one and were met with various stenches, which may have added some authenticity to the "This Game Stinks" campaign, but also possibly made a few parents regret their purchase. However, despite all this effort and the millions invested into the campaign, EarthBound was a commercial disappointment in the United States. While it sold a healthy 510,000 copies in Japan, the American market only managed around 140,000. It wasn't exactly the breakout hit that Nintendo had been hoping for, bearing in mind the sheer scale of the promotional push. Critics in the West weren't kind either. Many reviewers in 1995 mocked the game's deliberate retro, simple graphics, comparing it unfavourably to what was now possible on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. The irony, of course, is that EarthBound was ahead of its time in almost every way that mattered, just not the one that involved flashy 3D explosions. Still, long before American journalists were clutching their pearls over pixel art and fart jokes, work had already begun on the next Mother game. In fact, development on the sequel began so quickly that there were even plans to launch a second Mother title on the Super Nintendo itself, an entirely different version to what would later become EarthBound 64. Yes, there was a lost Mother game in between the two, which only adds to the mythos of one of Nintendo's most famously ill-fated franchises. This early version of Mother 3, the one planned before the N64 era fully kicked off, was actually intended to utilise pre-rendered graphics much like Donkey Kong Country. And frankly, it's not hard to see why. Rare's banana-hoarding blockbuster wasn't just a visual marvel, it went on to become the second best-selling game on the Super Nintendo. So, naturally, Nintendo and its collaborators were keen to bottle some of that magic. But this direction didn't last long. The moment the Nintendo Ultra 64 was officially unveiled, complete with plans for the ambitious, doomed-to-fail Nintendo 64 disk drive, all eyes turned to the future. The pre-rendered SNES version was swiftly binned in favour of something bolder, something polygonal, something three-dimensional. Just like Square, who famously packed their bags and stormed off to Sony when they realised that Final Fantasy VII wouldn't fit on a cartridge, the Mother team also faced the same reality that their big ideas needed bigger storage. So, EarthBound 64 was shifted to the N64DD, an add-on that promised vast expansions in space and scope. Of course, the DD would go on to become one of the most legendary flops in Nintendo history, but at the time it was considered a vital piece of hardware for ambitious projects. As touched on this channel before, Nintendo had grand plans for this magical disk drive, with titles like Ocarina of Time, SimCity 64 and Mario Artists all being pitched for the platform. Itoi Ever the visionary, found himself captivated by Super Mario 64 and cited its fully explorable 3D world as a major influence on where he wanted to take the next Mother entry. The original EarthBound development crew returned for this sequel, but not without some reshuffling. Some team members drifted off to other projects, while others were brought on board to expand the vision and wrangle the complexities of a true 3D RPG. What started as a modest sequel for the SNES was now evolving into one of the most ambitious games Nintendo had ever greenlit, for a system no one had actually bought yet. Unlike most Nintendo titles, EarthBound 64 did something rather un-Nintendo. It skipped its prototyping phase entirely. No cautious concept teasing and no playable proof of concept, Nintendo's top brass was so enamoured with how Mother 2 had performed in Japan, long before the Western market had even got its first whiff of on it, that they basically shoved a development kit into Itoi's hands and said, "We love your work, now do it again, but bigger." What could possibly go wrong? To his credit, Shigesato Itoi didn't just want to make a game, he wanted to make a movie, or at least a game that felt like one.
We make movies.
Cinematic storytelling, dynamic characters, emotional weight, all the hallmarks of a prestige Hollywood drama delivered via the charmingly oddball filter of Mother. By E3 of 1997, Shigeru Miyamoto was confidently floating the idea that the new Mother title would be one of the 4 launch games for the Nintendo 64 DD, slated for release in 1998. Confidence, as it turns out, is not a substitute for completed code. As for the story, Itoi's early draft for EarthBound 64 was a far cry from the light-hearted, kid-led adventures of its predecessors. The plot was originally going to follow a sleazy, small-time private investigator, the kind of guy who probably smells like cheap aftershave and broken promises, as he gets tangled up in a murder case. The story unfolds through the memories of a young flower shop clerk who slowly pieces together things over time. The real narrative trick here was that the setting itself would change and evolve with her recollection. As she remembered more, the city would grow, shift and reveal new layers, a clever workaround to the common JRPG issue of backtracking without narrative justification. Itoi envisioned a world where the gossip of townsfolk would eventually evolve dynamically as the story progressed, a concept that would later be partially realised in Yu Suzuki's Shenmue, which, as loyal viewers will recall, I've already covered on this channel with great enthusiasm. Milk's perfect for a schoolboy, I say. Looking back, both Itoi and Miyamoto would later compare their grand vision for EarthBound 64's story progression to something akin to The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, a game that, as we all know, threw out the rulebook and replaced it with a haunted clock, a time loop, and enough existential dread to make a philosophy student cry. Itoi wasn't just trying to write a bigger story, he was trying to reinvent how a story worked in a video game. His idea was to divide the adventure into chapters, each functioning like a standalone episode in a strange anthology. Some chapters would be classic RPG fare, turn-based battles, psychic powers, kids saving the world, and others are going to be entirely cinematic sequences with no gameplay at all, just vibes. He even dabbled in a theatre-inspired concept where characters were designed as 3D puppets that moved around a digital stage. Sounds adorable in theory, but in practice, each scene required laborious, bespoke programming. Another idea tied to this chapter structure was to swap protagonists between episodes. The goal was to let players experience the unfolding story from multiple perspectives, giving each character their own arc, growth, and emotional weight. It was complex, it was innovative, and it was, frankly, never going to fit on a Nintendo 64 cartridge or even the 64DD disc for that matter. As development dragged on and limitations began to close in, Itoi was forced to start trimming. First, it was the dynamic chapter gameplay. Then came the still images replacing full scenes. Eventually, a staggering 7 to 9 chapters were reportedly scrapped altogether. All that ambition slowly chiseled away by the cold, unyielding hand of technical reality. They say kill your darlings, but Itoi ended up slaughtering the entire orphanage. As development dragged on, the story Itoi wanted to tell continued to shift and evolve. One recurring theme that bubbled to the surface was the idea of chimeras, unnatural fusions of creatures, bodies that shouldn't go together but somehow do. It's an idea that ran deep, not just in the plot but even in the aesthetics. The world of Mother 3 was envisioned as part metallic, part wooden, two materials that, like in many of Itoi's ideas, just weren't meant to be merged. The result was something both beautiful and vaguely unsettling. Eventually, the core story began to take shape. Set 10 years after the events of the original Mother, the game now followed a new protagonist, Flint, a rugged cowboy in the mould of Clint Eastwood. Flint would be joined by his two sons, Lucas and Klaus, and their loyal dog Boney. Their mission was to stand up against the Pig Army, a strange, militarised force wielding low-tech machinery in a plot to enslave humanity. But even as the narrative solidified, the game still wasn't ready. Development creaked along under the weight of technical limitations and shifting expectations. And yet, at Spaceworld of 1999, Nintendo surprised everyone by showing off a playable demo. According to a journalist at IGN, the game appeared to be quite far along. The demo featured a hovercraft cruising through a desert canyon, a labyrinthine snake dungeon, a bustling town filled with NPCs, and, for good measure, a minecart sequence because every late 90s game needed one of those, apparently. Just like in the original EarthBound, enemies would be visible in the overworld and bumping into one would trigger a traditional turn-based battle. And yes, these psychedelic battle backgrounds were back too, ensuring every random encounter looked like you were fighting sentient eyeballs during a Pink Floyd laser show. As for that Spaceworld demo, IGN walked away thoroughly impressed. They reported that it featured one of the most cinematic cutscenes seen on the N64 to date. The controls were described as intuitive, the soundtrack was apparently well orchestrated and genuinely memorable, and the 3D engine itself was called strong. High praise considering that this was still a system that ran on cartridges and sheer optimism. One comparison that IGN made that's especially interesting is to Live Alive, a Japan-only Super Famicom RPG that also told its story through multiple protagonists. It was a nice compliment and a fitting one given how EarthBound 64 was shaping up to be a similarly sprawling experimental narrative. But then, silence. Despite the promising demo and whispers of progress, the game all but vanished from public view. No new footage, no updates, no release dates. Eventually, word broke that EarthBound 64 was being transitioned off the 64DD entirely, now planned as a standard N64 cartridge release with an optional expansion disc, a technical downgrade masked as a development pivot. And if you've been following Nintendo history for more than 5 minutes, you'll know exactly what happens next. By the time the year 2000 rolled around and we were all nervously waiting to see if our microwaves would explode from the Y2K bug, IGN was confidently reporting that EarthBound 64 was nearing the finish line. Sure, there was still no confirmed release date, but the assumption was that the game had to be close. After all, it had been in development for years by this point. Surely, something had to give soon, right? Well, not quite. The Nintendo 64DD, which had been intended as the game's technological backbone, had utterly flopped in Japan and wasn't even being released elsewhere, so it wasn't much of a shock when EarthBound 64 failed to show its face at E3 of that year. But hopes remained high for Spaceworld 2000, and then the curtain lifted. Instead of playable demos or new footage, Mother fans were treated to something else entirely. Disappointment! Gift wrapped by none other than Satoru Iwata. He didn't just cancel the game outright. Not quite. Instead, he explained that while the Mother series itself wasn't dead, this particular entry would no longer be coming to the Nintendo 64. It was in development hell, they insisted. According to Shigeru Miyamoto, who also turned up to soften the blow, the project was being shelved so its resources could be redirected to Project Dolphin, the code name for what would eventually become the Nintendo GameCube. Miyamoto stated that after 3 years, the game was only about 30% complete. Itoi, ever the optimist, estimated that it would take another 2 years to actually finish. As for Miyamoto's involvement, despite being credited as a producer, he'd barely set foot near the development team. He was off doing other Miyamoto things, like presumably inventing another way to make Mario jump. And so, after nearly half a decade in development limbo, EarthBound 64 was no more. At least on that platform. As for Satoru Iwata, his involvement with EarthBound 64 became increasingly limited during the latter stages of development. At the time, he was still helming HAL Laboratory, a company teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, which meant that he often pulled away to deal with more urgent fires. Things got so intense, in fact, that Iwata was hospitalised in 1999 due to stress, so while his name was attached to the project, his body and mind were very much elsewhere. With Keystar stretched thin and the game barely a third of the way to complete after 3 exhausting years, Nintendo faced a harsh truth. Something had to change. Cancelling Mother 3 outright would have been a waste not just of money but of potential. But were they ever going to be able to complete this game and make it a commercial success, even on the GameCube? Even Nintendo admitted they'd got it wrong. They had chased the 3D Dragon like everyone else in the mid-90s and ended up burning a hole through one of their most promising projects. Years later, they would openly admit they felt ashamed of how things played out. Years rolled by and the ghost of EarthBound 64 continued to haunt the imaginations of die-hard fans. In 2003, Nintendo re-released Mother 1 and 2 as a dual cartridge for the Game Boy Advance in Japan, and that, as they say, opened the floodgates. Fans immediately began clamouring for a third instalment, the one they had been so cruelly denied. Petitions sprang up, letters were written, message boards buzzed with conspiracy theories. Everyone wanted Mother 3, the version that had once lived and died on the Nintendo 64. Itoi, for his part, initially saw it as impossible. The project had collapsed under its own ambition, the team had scattered and the industry had moved on. But after a long period of deliberation with Nintendo and perhaps some soul-searching of his own, the green light was given. Mother 3 would live again, this time on the Game Boy Advance. It appears that Miyamoto and Iwata began discussions about reviving the project on the Game Boy Advance, but their reasoning? Shigesato Itoi's greatest strength had never been spectacle, it was storytelling. His power wasn't in polygon counts or high-fidelity lighting engines, but in writing that could actually make you laugh or cry, or question the meaning of existence in the space of a few dialogue boxes. A handheld version would still take years to finish and would require a full team of around 50 developers, but it would also free Itoi from the expectations of a cutting-edge 3D experience. It was, in hindsight, the right move. Rather than trying to replicate the abandoned 3D version, Itoi opted to reimagine the game from the ground up, preserving the story and characters he'd spent years crafting, but now translating them into 2D, adopting a visual style deliberately reminiscent of Mother 2. The timing was perfect, players were beginning to realise that shiny graphics didn't necessarily equal good games, and Itoi's minimalist, emotionally resonant world felt refreshingly authentic. But this new Mother 3 wouldn't just look different, it would feel different too. The Nintendo 64 version had been deliberately vague, filled with sparse dialogue and abstract narrative beats that left plenty to interpretation, but as Itoi himself matured, as a writer, a father and a man, the tone of the game shifted. He began writing with more emotional clarity and purpose. The new development team brought fresh eyes, and together they created a game that was still surreal, still satirical, but now had a deeper emotional core. This wasn't just the sequel that fans had begged for, it was the sequel that Itoi needed to make. Itoi has often spoken candidly about the themes woven into Mother 3, and one of his most powerful reflections is this: sometimes bad people need help more than good people do. It's a sentiment that echoes throughout the game's melancholic storyline, a reminder that pain, trauma and redemption aren't limited to the obvious heroes and villains. But of all of the lines Itoi wrote, the one that stuck with him the most was heartbreakingly simple. He must be tired. It's a line that, in context, may appear small, even throwaway, but for eToy, it encapsulates something far more profound. It's not just about one character, it's about everyone. It's about the burden we all carry, the quiet struggles we face, and the need to recognise our own fragility in a world that's spinning towards its inevitable end. As for the game itself, it finally did arrive at long last in 2006, in Japan, on the Game Boy Advance, which by that point had already been largely abandoned in favour of the Nintendo DS. So yes, it was criminally late, but considering the development of Mother 3 originally began on the Super Nintendo all the way back in 1994, we should probably be thankful it was released at all. Mother 3, against all odds, finally made it into the hands of fans. Well, some fans, Japanese fans specifically, and the rest of us, we're still waiting for an official localization that, let's be honest, is probably never coming.
Come on, Reggie, give us Mother 3!
How about this instead?
In the West, the EarthBound series has slowly clawed its way out of obscurity and into cult superstardom. Much of it is thanks to one fateful roster pick, Ness, showing up in the very first Super Smash Bros. For the Nintendo 64. For many players, it was their first exposure to EarthBound, and for Nintendo, it was like accidentally unlocking a secret fan base they didn't even know they had. Since then, the series has been drip-fed back into public consciousness. EarthBound got a much-deserved second wind via the Wii U's Virtual Console and later the Super Nintendo Classic Mini. Even the original Mother, the one that was abandoned for Western release back in the NES era, eventually got a formal outing as EarthBound's beginnings. But Mother 3? That's the stubborn holdout, the one Nintendo continues to keep locked away like it's cursed. To this day, it remains the only game in the trilogy without an official English release, which frankly is fine because fan translators have already done a better job than Nintendo probably would have done anyway. The script is heartfelt, the localization is excellent, and it's freely available if you know where to look. So really, if you haven't played Mother 3 by now, that's on you. I mean, really, by this point, what are you waiting for? A permission slip from Reggie? He's not even with the company anymore. Sadly, even if you do play the wonderful fan translation of Mother 3, there's still one missing piece. The EarthBound game we can't play. The one lost in a fog of shattered ambition and shifting priorities. EarthBound 64 remains the holy grail of cancelled Nintendo projects, unplayable and utterly fascinating. But just when you thought the story had ended, EarthBound 64 gave us one last twist in the tale. Just a couple of years ago, over 2 decades since the project vanished into the ether, new footage of the game emerged. All thanks to a collector going by the name of Zen, who managed to snag a copy of the 1998 Nintendo Company report from a Japanese auction site. Tucked away inside was never-before-seen footage of the lost game in motion. For fans of the series, it was nothing short of a revelation, a pixelated postcard from a parallel timeline where EarthBound 64 actually existed. Brief as it was, it offered a tantalising glimpse of what could have been and fueled the hopes that even more remnants of the project might still be out there. So here's hoping the next big Nintendo Giga Leak blesses us with more scraps from the cutting room floor, or better yet, a fully playable build. Well, one can dream. Don't forget, you can nab Chrono Trigger for just $7.32, the OG Final Fantasy for just $7.21, as well as up to 90% off of thousands of games, both retro and modern alike. Grab a shopping list of titles for next to nothing, or if you want to support what I do in a more personal way, access my behind-the-scenes cosplay library and more over on Patreon. See you soon.